Tulku Hungkar Dorje was a well-known Tibetan spiritual leader and a philanthropist from Lungye Monastery in Tibet, widely acknowledged for his selfless service to the underserved community and for his activism to preserve Tibetan culture, language, and religion. Unfortunately, Rinpoche passed away on March 28 of this year in Vietnam. The same day he was transferred to the local public security office under the watch of Vietnamese officers and Chinese secret agents. Tenzin Kunkhen, a research associate at the Human Rights Desk under Central Tibetan Administration, is here with us today to talk about China breaching major international laws with such ease and unaccountability, their growing brutality towards Tibetan people, and repeated human rights violation. Welcome to our program, Kunkhen. Kunkhen, so tell me, how does a single individual like Tulku Hungkar Dorje pose great threat to a country like China, so much so that the Chinese government had to end his life?
When we talk about the Chinese government's targeting of a prominent and revered Tibetan religious leader like Tulku Hungkar Dorje, we really need to look into his life and his philanthropic work, not only in the religious field, but also on the social and cultural aspect of Tibetan identity. So Tulku Hungkar Dorje, I believe, was mainly targeted by the Chinese authority because of three main reasons. First, because of his religious influence, and second, his outspoken advocacy for Tibetan identity, and third, for the cultural leadership that he possessed. As a Tulku, or a reincarnate Lama, he possessed a great influence over Tibetan community, and as noted by one of the Tibetan netizens following his death, he wrote that Rinpoche, as a learned Tibetan leader, slowly passed away. We are left behind like a sheep without a shepherd, which shows that he is a leader. And in these circumstances, these religious leaders, as well as Tibetan community leaders inside Tibet, they act as a ray of light or a beacon of hope for these Tibetan people to guide them towards the path of truth and justice. So much so that Chinese government see them as a threat to their own insecurity and unlawful ruler of Tibet. So, and also we have to look into perspective his Hungkar Rinpoche's connection with His Holiness, because we know that Rinpoche has traveled outside Tibet, and he has also studied in Debung Monastery in India, and then he has traveled to United States for a few years to study. So in that period of time, Hungkar Rinpoche has met His Holiness and has gained many followers, not only in Tibet but in worldwide. So China see this international, connection that Rinpoche made as a threat to their rule.
Right. So, as you rightly said, the killing of Tulku Hungkar Rinpoche just goes to show how insecure China is about the Tibetan spiritual leaders, such as Rinpoche himself and of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. But tell me, how is China able to get away with such horrific level of transnational repression? What is the role of international community here to take legal action against the Chinese government?
So when we talk about transnational repression, China is notorious for its track record of transnational repression worldwide. Because when we look into the report published by the Freedom House in 2022, it states that since 2014, there has been 854 cases of transnational repressions committed by 38 governments in 91 different countries. And out of those 854 cases, 214 cases are being committed by China itself, so which is 1/4 of the cases of transnational repression. And I think it is important to talk about the pattern of transnational repression by the Chinese government against Tibetans in exile. So there are mainly 4 patterns, and first one is the information disruption. So we know that the Chinese government, they disrupts information communication between the Tibetans living in exile with the Tibetans inside Tibet. So this is one of the first transnational repression pattern. And then secondly, the surveillance and infiltration. So the Chinese government routinely surveils and monitor the Tibetan living in diaspora community so that they can use these personal information to blackmail them later on. And also we see the pattern of coercion, because the Chinese government, their transnational repression consists of routinely coercing the Tibetan in diaspora, and not only for the safety of the Tibetans in exile, but also threatening the life of their relatives living inside Tibet. So it somehow controls their activism in exile, which comes under the behavioral control by the Chinese government. And lastly, economic and we say cultural suppression, because in that case we have cases of Tibetans being stopped in their communication with their relatives inside Tibet, in terms of sending monetary funds to their relatives, as well as attending teachings of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in exile. So coming back into the case of Hungkar Rinpoche, I think physically hurting and murdering, killing of Tibetan religious leader is I think one of the worst form of transnational repression, and it is I think very important duty and responsibility of not only of the Tibetans but of the international community itself to hold accountable the perpetrator of Hungkar Rinpoche's suspicious death. In this case, we have Vietnamese government as well as the Chinese government. And if I talk about a few of these avenues where international community can really raise their voice, first is through diplomatic pressure. And as we know that so far, we see the pattern of international community as well as the CTA itself giving out official statements condemning the Vietnamese government of blocking out the information and the truth behind the Rinpoche's demise. In terms of human rights avenue, international community can reach out to the United Nations, because inside United Nations they have different mechanisms as well as procedures we call treaty bodies, to which they can reach out and raise the case of Hungkar Rinpoche. And these treaty bodies, they can in turn pressure Vietnamese and Chinese government through communications as well as public statements. There are mandates like working group on the involuntary and enforced disappearance. So they accept individual cases. So NGOs and states can submit individual reports of Hungkar Rinpoche's case. And then we also have human rights treaty bodies such as Committee on Torture, Committee on Civil and Political Rights, and then human rights on torture and cruel and inhumane treatment of individual. And lastly, we also have Office of the High Commissioner, who can give out statements condemning the violation of rights by the different governments, as well as they also have the power to put forth a fact-finding mission to that particular country to investigate an individual's demise.
Right. So when we talk about transnational repression, in this case, it's not just China and Tibet, right? Vietnam is also in the picture. So what do you think is the responsibility of the Vietnamese government in this extrajudicial killing? Because Rinpoche was not a fugitive evading capture, right? He was just a foreigner in Vietnam.
Right. It is very important to look into how Rinpoche was in Vietnam in the first place. Because we know that back in Tibet, probably around last year, Rinpoche was targeted by the Chinese government because of his active advocacy for Tibetan identity. Like I mentioned, the speech that he gave in July 2024 was the last speech in public, and after that he mysteriously disappeared from public view. So which shows that the Chinese government have been keeping a close eye on Rinpoche all these years, and because of that the Chinese government have arrested Rinpoche and interrogated him, intimidating him into not, to stop his philanthropic work as well as his activism for Tibetan identity. And after that, Rinpoche kept a low profile in Vietnam. Not till March 25th, when the Vietnamese authorities, in alleged coalition with the Chinese police, came to his room to arrest him. So which, in accordance with international law and standard, which Vietnam is obligated to protect and respect, is not legal, because Vietnam has the obligation of protecting any citizens of foreign country while they are in their territory. And also we must know that Vietnam as a country has signed and ratified at least 9 or 10 international treaties and human rights protocols, which shows that Vietnam is bound to respect the rights enshrined in these international covenants and treaties. So we talk about responsibility of Vietnam. So in all the proceedings following the death of Rinpoche, Vietnamese government have failed to comply with the international standards, because starting from his detention and arrest from his room to not publicly disclosing any transparent information on his death, and then on the Chinese authorities' perspective, they have implemented a very suspicious information blackout back in Tibet, in and around his monastery, where people are not allowed to talk or share any information on Rinpoche's death. So, talking about Vietnamese government's obligation in respecting human rights, we have first and foremost the International Human Rights Law of International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So under this protocol, Vietnam government is obligated, it is a duty of Vietnamese government to investigate and show transparency in dealing with such cases of individuals' death in Vietnam soil. And Vietnam have signed and ratified this protocol. And according to this protocol, Vietnam is also obligated to investigate the death in custody, in this case Hungkar Rinpoche's death, which Vietnam has failed to do so far. Talking about Vietnamese government's being a party to Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, Vietnamese government is obligated to give a clear and transparent information to the family of Hungkar Rinpoche. Plus, they are obligated to give a dignified burial or cremation in accordance with the wishes of his family and community, which we don't see in this case. They are not allowed it or obligated to refrain from colluding with any foreign entities, in this case the Chinese government, which Vietnam has failed to do and comply so far. So these are the major responsibility of the Vietnamese government in the case of Hungkar Rinpoche, and we see that Vietnamese government has failed to comply with all these international protocols, which paints a very suspicious picture of the government itself in international platform. And it is very important that the Vietnamese government must release a full report of investigation as well as transparency in the death of Hungkar Rinpoche's death.
Right. So Kundila, as you said, Vietnam has signed at least 9 to 10 treaties on safeguarding human rights, right? But we've gathered so far that Rinpoche's body has been cremated in Vietnam and wasn't returned to his family or to his monastery in Tibet. So with this cremation, tell me what kind of evidences did we lose on? What clarity could have come out had his body been given back to Tibet?
Right. So Vietnamese government have very suspiciously given the cause of death as a heart illness, which is very unusual. And Rinpoche, because it is important to point out here that if Vietnamese government is really telling the truth, then they have nothing to lose by disclosing a clear and transparent information on the actual cause of the death. By hiding the actual, the only way of providing evidence on the actual death of Hungkar Rinpoche, Vietnamese government, it is very suspicious on part of the Vietnamese government. And also Hungkar Rinpoche's family members and the Tibetan community in Tibet, by getting back a body of a reincarnate Lama or Tulku, it is respect, first respect, and for the tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, that proper burial be given, right, in accordance with the wishes of his family as well as the monastery. And secondly, we have lost a huge evidence because China, as we know, that is notorious for its committing torture, cruel treatment of Tibetans inside Tibet. So by getting his body, we will get to know what really happened. Was there any torture or any sign of ill treatment on Rinpoche while being in the custody of the Vietnamese police?
So Kungila, we were able to extract the unfortunate demise of Hungkar Rinpoche, right? But given the fact that there's information censorship or complete blackout in Tibet, as my last question, can you tell me how many of these tortures and killings passes in silence and the information doesn't travel outside Tibet?
Yeah. So ever since the Chinese unlawful occupation of Tibet since 1959, we know that they have killed roughly 1.2 million Tibetans have lost their life in the uprising in 1959. There has been, I believe, many cases of the killings and extrajudicial execution of Tibetans. Once an incident happens inside Tibet, the Tibetan people takes a huge risk of persecution, risk of imprisonment, just to get that information out of Tibet, so that international community can pressure the Chinese government to stop this oppression inside Tibet. Our sources have informed us there are lots of unbelievable repression and suffering that Tibetans go inside Tibet, which I don't believe that sharing here is appropriate because there are obviously security reasons involved in the well-being of the Tibetans living inside Tibet. A case to study here is the suspicious circumstances under which Tenzin Kunkhen was allegedly murdered by Chinese authorities. Because till now, there hasn't been any credible information on how Tenzin Kunkhen has passed away in Chinese custody. And the advocacy is still ongoing in today's period. And also, we can look at the demise of Tulku Dawa in 2022, because it is interesting that the Chinese government, right after the passing of Tulku Tenzin Dawa, the Chinese government have intensified its restrictions on his followers. Only the followers from few regions are allowed to pay respect and tribute to Rinpoche's body. They were instructed to not use any phones and electronic devices to take any evidence of that very particular incident. And they are heavily intimidated into sharing any information to the exiled community. And so there are many cases of extrajudicial killing. And I also must want to share that we are actually in the process of compiling the deaths of individuals and Tibetans inside Tibet in Chinese custody because of torture and death. And also when we talk about the custodial deaths of Tibetans. Since 2000 alone, around approximately 90 Tibetans have lost their lives in Chinese custody because of torture and persecution, and that too excluding those individuals gunned down by Chinese government in 2008 Tibetan uprising. So if we take into account all these numbers, then it's a huge number that the Tibetans were killed by the Chinese government. So I think it is also important to look into Chinese control of information, because in many cases the news of individuals' death in Chinese custody comes out very late, and in few cases after 2 or 3 years after their death, the news report comes. In case of Norsang, he passed away in 2019, reportedly in Chinese custody because of torture. But the news of his death came into public attention 2 years later, which shows how China is controlling information. And in that precedent, we can draw a conclusion that how many more cases have happened inside Tibet which hasn't come out yet. So, so to draw a conclusion on this, we see that the Chinese government is notorious for its transnational repression, and unless and until the Vietnamese government adhere to the international community's appeal for proper investigation and transparency in Rinpoche's case, the international community is shrouded in secrecy, and they are prevented from a case where there's a very likely chance that the Chinese government have committed a transnational repression on Rinpoche, and which also shows that the human rights violations is still endemic inside Tibet, and the international community must continue to raise their voice against the Chinese government to stop the repression and cultural assimilation of Tibetans inside Tibet, and they must call the Chinese government to respect the rights and fundamental freedoms of Tibetans inside Tibet.
And then also there's a rising number of atrocities that China continues to commit in Tibet, and the need for more global media attention. Thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Thank you very much.
That is all for this interview. Thank you all for joining us. I will see you in the next episode of In Conversation with Tibet TV.